Great, thanks, Jess. Ilana?
Thanks. So my previous work focused on, as Rob said, this cohort in Fiji, and part of my work really led to an observation that microbes are adaptive across the world and carry genes that give them these adaptive qualities. And so that was really an inroads for me for thinking about the microbes in the built environment. And the way I started thinking about this was about disinfectants. So disinfectants are basically antibiotics, but they're different from antiseptics in that they're fairly toxic, and so we can only use them in the built environment. They're compounds and they're compounds that basically we don't want to ingest or even use topically in some cases. And so really the question that's driving my research in this area is, how do microbes adapt to disinfectants? How do they respond? What are differences in sensitivities? And what impacts do disinfectants have on overall communities and specific microbes themselves? And so just to kind of outline a few themes that have emerged in my thinking about disinfectants in the built environment. One is that because disinfectants are basically a bigger hammer than antibiotics, because we don't have this kind of barrier to make it sure that it's non-toxic, the mechanisms of action are fairly broad. And that means that they might have very different effects across different environments and different organisms in different environments. We mainly used them for a public health purpose to stop infectious or pathogenic or opportunistic infections, but they have other consequences that are worth thinking about, and also about how they're used and what effect they have. Because at one point we want to balance the efficacy of these disinfectants, but we also want to balance this against the risks that they might hold as well. And so one of the risks that is fairly well known is that some organisms can develop resistance against disinfectants. Organisms like Acinetobacter baumannii can develop resistance, and actually in a hospital environment can grow biofilms on surfaces and that are resistant to cleaning. And so that's one example that's probably the poster child of what can go wrong when we use disinfectants. So we don't know how their sensitivity of different organisms have across these different disinfectants, but also the way the disinfectant is actually used. So hydrogen peroxide, for example, can turn to water, and so if hospitals or schools or whoever is using these disinfectants, the disinfectants might actually lose potency over time. And also there might be biofilms that are developing on different surfaces, and those biofilms may be less resistant to whatever disinfectants we might want to use against them. And so when so a theme that I mentioned, this balance between efficacy and risks. Other things that we need to think about are toxicity of these disinfectants, bioaccumulation, about how much exposure we're having to them over time and whether that has any impact on health or the health of our environments, how these agents are disposed of, and what effect that might have on either other built environments or natural environments that they're disposed in. So I'm curious also to hear about the water treatment and what kind of chemicals that we might be ingesting as well. We also I want to consider the use of alternatives. So maybe where we shouldn't be using disinfectants, how else can we modify our environment by making surfaces made out of different materials, having different textures that promote or antagonize the accumulation of organisms. And the last kind of overall thought thought that I want to kind of end my brief introduction with is this question of choice. So when we think about modifying the built environment, it's really a global choice that we're all making. It's a public health decision. It's really a collective decision. Whereas taking antibiotics is a personal decision that we make, much like the use of pesticides on agricultural farms, the use of disinfectants and other chemicals that we might modify our environment, even such interventions as releasing organisms into our environment for some public health benefit, is really a group choice that we have to make. And likewise, not using disinfectants or other agents. So if we're walking into a hospital, how would people feel if that hospital, for example, wasn't being cleaned with some amount of disinfectant? And so really, again, the two things that I think are the two themes that I think have emerged are really this balance that we have to strike between efficacy and risk, and also how we make these decisions as a collective.